hard for me to stand still. So we've arranged for me to be able to wander a bit. If you lose me, it's because I left. So just find me. I'm going to start by telling you a story of the Suli. Now, unless you're Cherokee, you probably don't know what a Suli is. A Suli's a buzzard, okay? So there once was a Suli, and the Suli lived in the desert. And this was the oldest and the wisest of all the Sulis. And the Suli knew how to find food and water in the desert. And all the other buzzards came to this Suli to make sure that they too would survive. They followed this one. They watched. When this Suli went up to soar, they knew it was time to look for food, and this Suli knew exactly how to do it. Went very, very high in the air, could see everything, and could spot the food that they needed, and all the buzzards would go with this Suli. Clearly a wise elder, this Suli. One night, the Suli went to sleep, and the next morning when he woke up, he was not in the desert. It was a forest. It was a rainforest. It was wet. It was uncomfortable. There were huge trees all around. He could see nothing because of all the obstacles that were in his way. Suddenly, after years of being the wisest elder amongst all the Suli, he didn't know how he was going to survive. When he would fly to great heights to see the food he needed to survive, he couldn't see anything because the canopy of trees didn't allow him to see the ground where he normally would find his food. So about the time he was absolutely convinced that he will die, a young, small bird said, "You need to quit flying up that high trying to find your food and come with me and we'll walk on the ground a while and you'll find something to eat." And so for the first time in a long time, the Suli listened to some bird much smaller, much younger, not a wise elder, and survived. One of the things that many of us have as an obstacle to being great change agents is that we know we are wise elders. And we have missed the fact that the terrain has changed around us. So my talk's not going to be so much about what change needs to happen or why it needs to happen. I think you wouldn't be at this conference if you hadn't been paying attention to the fact that we need to change engineering education. And a lot of us have very good ideas that we have tried and tested, and we can show you the data to prove our way is better, right? But for some reason, no matter how repeatedly we show the data that our way is better, the enterprise, the large engineering education enterprise, is just not following us. I don't know if they just can't understand the data. I don't know if they're just stubborn. I'll talk a little bit about probably what is the problem as to why, in spite of the fact that there are many, many people across the country, including the National Academy of Engineers, NSF, you name it, many great universities have been talking about changing engineering education. As best I can tell, we talk about this as engineers continuously. As a matter of fact, look 100 years ago. They were talking about it. Look 50 years ago. Clearly, they were talking about it. We are still talking about it. And what's amazing is, while in truth, the reason why we're talking about the change is changing, we keep talking about the same kind of change that needs to happen in general. How the faculty need to behave with their students is what we're talking about all the time. So let's think about this a little bit. Let's look at Charles Vest's recent statement about what we need to think about as change. As we think of challenges ahead, it is important to remember that students are driven by passion, curiosity, engagement, and dreams. Although we cannot know exactly what they should be taught, we can focus on the environment in which they learn and the forces, ideas, inspirations, and empowering situations to which they are exposed. In the long run, making universities and engineering schools exciting, creative, adventurous, rigorous, demanding, and an empowering milieu is more important than specifying curricular details. I say this because I spend so much time with my colleagues on my campus in debates about whether we would cover this topic or that topic in a particular class, whether we will use active and teaming learning or whether we will do it from a lecture place or something like that. And we miss the discussion, or rarely have the discussion about, was this exciting? Was this adventurous? Was this empowering to the students? We're so wrapped up in our perspective. Now, another person, Charles is the current president of the National Academy of Engineers, but many of you will remember William Wolfe, who focused quite a bit as the previous president of the National Academy of Engineers on engineering education. He had this to say about the change that is upon us. He said, in the 1950s, we changed fundamentally the nature of engineering education from purely technical to the engineering science model of today. The motivation for change, the howling wolf at the door, was the need to understand science to contribute to the national security in face of the nuclear threat. If there is a howling wolf around the corner today, it might be the outsourcing of engineering jobs overseas. But my description of the situation is that of a creeping crisis, one whose consequences are significant, but they accrue incrementally and slowly, and they never raise an alarm amongst the professionals who teach in engineering education. So many of us have been alarmed for some time. But we're going to talk about the fact that our alarm often causes our colleagues to shut down, not to actually change their behavior. So let me give you something of an analogy. How many of you saw the movie The Bodyguard? For you young people who didn't see it because it came out in 1992 and that was just, you were a little young at that time, they're going to make it again. Okay, they make it every couple of decades, so you'll get a chance to see it. This time Rihanna's going to star in it. Last time it was Whitney Houston that was the individual that needed to be guarded, and Kevin Costner was the bodyguard. And the bodyguard, Frank Farmer, was hired because there was a real threat to this rock star, to this singer. What I want to focus is not on the whole message of the movie, but I want to focus on two characters. Frank Farmer, the bodyguard, the former Secret Service agent, the guy who was hired because he's an expert at really important bodyguard activities, and the previous bodyguard, whose name was Tony. I don't know what his last name was, but Tony. Now, Tony was a good bodyguard. He's a big guy. He could handle the normal challenges to protecting the client that are faced the vast majority of the time. The vast majority of the time, it wasn't necessarily somebody particularly smarter than the bodyguard who was trying to get to the client. It was just somebody a little bit out of their head, too excited about the star that was present. So he could use bulk force. He could use traditional approaches. He didn't have to predict too far into the future. He just had to scan the moment and make sure that he reacted appropriately and quickly to the moment. But see, a threat came along that somehow some wise people knew was bigger than that. So they hired this special bodyguard, Frank Farmer. Now, Frank predicted the unusual event that could happen. Frank, not always obligingly, got the whole team of people to change their behavior so that they were ready for the unexpected. Frank knew how to integrate technology, psychology, human interactions, how to watch for what Tony knew how to watch for, but how to predict and know how to look for more. Now, clearly in the movie, Frank was the unusual bodyguard, the very expensive bodyguard, the one you had to work really hard to find and then pay a whole lot to hire. Here's the dilemma. In engineering education, we are graduating mostly Tonys. We are graduating, maybe in proportion to what they have been needed up to this time, enough Frank Farmers to be able to handle the really big challenges that are coming along. But those challenges are accelerating. And we can't graduate 5% of the engineers to be Frank Farmers. We have to flip that around. We can only afford 5% of the engineering graduates to be Tonys. We need far more to be much more skilled for the unusual, unpredicted, not common problem, who can still handle the common problem, than we ever have before. We need to go beyond what we can do for 50 or 80 or even 400 students. When we graduate somewhere around 70,000 engineers per year in the nation, the challenge for this conference is not what you can set up and do for 50 or 80 or even 1,000 students. The challenge is, how are we going to make sure the vast majority of those 70,000 graduates in engineering education are ready to meet the unexpected in ways we can't even imagine right now? And we're pretty certain that what we've been doing, although not bad, is not going to be good enough. We can keep talking to faculty about that, but if we keep talking to them as if what they've been doing is bad, we don't seem to get anywhere. But if you've heard Gloria Rogers speak, she said, you don't have to be bad to get better. And that's our message. We're not saying what's been going on is bad. It's been good. It's been excellent for where we were. It's just not good enough for where we're going. Where are we going? If you look at an article written, it was called Accelerating Change, the Complexity of Problems, and the Quality of Our Thinking. It's not about engineering, but Richard Paul and Dylan Beach said, these two characteristics then, accelerating change and increasing complexity, with their incessant demand for a new capacity to adapt, for the new, rare ability to think effectively through new problems and situations in new ways, sound the death knell for traditional methods of learning how to survive in the world in which we live. How can we adapt to reality when reality won't give us time to master it before it changes itself again and again in ways we cannot anticipate? This is the society in which we are graduating our students. We've all known for a long time what we teach them isn't going to necessarily be what they need 4 or so years out. But what we're saying now is even the framing and the modeling in which we are often teaching stuff isn't going to be the kind of problems they're going to be working on. So we really have to think about this differently. I will tell you that James Carr said, if you prepare somebody against surprise, you have trained them. If you prepare somebody for surprise, you have educated them. This is what we must do. So what I'm going to talk about is why have we, who've been working for at least, if you're like me, a couple of decades, some of you 3-4 decades on change, some of you maybe just a short time, Why have we not been more effective at getting the large enterprise of engineering education to change? What's your best ideas? Why we haven't been as effective? Yes, please. We've got too much other work and this work to do. Or the change itself is too much work. Yes?
We're self-replicating.
We are self-replicating, okay? We have a whole system that tends to produce what we already have. Yes, please.
Persistence of change.
Persistence of change? Resistance to change, okay? Yes?
No threat.
There's no real threat.
Certainly no perceived threat.
Right. It's kind of the creeping crisis. Yes, please.
We actually tend to blame the students.
It is, of course, the students' fault. Those, yeah. That or the high school teachers, and if they're in the room, then it must be the middle school teachers, and then of course it's the elementary. Could be the parents, but it's somebody else's fault. Yes, please.
Research valued over education.
Research how we value things in our enterprise. Yes.
We want to compromise education.
We don't want to compromise. We don't want to compromise education. We're worried about what the compromises will be. Yes, sir.
We're trying to change something that already exists. We're not starting new.
We don't get to start from scratch. Olin kind of got to start from scratch. Most of us don't get to start from scratch. But even Olin had pressures all around. They did a wonderful job, but they had pressures too about what does an engineer look like? What do engineering faculty look like? So, yes?
Our conceptions of human development are extraordinarily narrow.
Our conception of human development are narrow. Most of us didn't ever study learning. Most of you who have now studied learning, education, pedagogy, teaching, which is not normal for an engineer faculty to study. Most of you have done that, but few of you have studied change. Yes?
Yes, Hume's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, says that it's so hard for people to change their paradigm that essentially you have to wait till all the old people die off.
Thank you. That is a model. I used to, when a little bit younger, I used to threaten, because we can make this threat in Texas, you can't make this threat up here in Mass. Threaten that we may have to help some of the old people to die off. But, they're passing a law in Texas now because we're real worried that universities have not been open to us carrying concealed weapons on campus. We find, for some reason that's beyond me, that to be a real problem. I guess we have to worry about something. So let me read something about changing the culture, written by Being First Incorporated. Culture change is a great mystery to most leaders because they deal exclusively with the external dimensions of organizational reality. That is, structures, technology, systems, protocols, marketing, competition, and are not skilled or attentive to the internal human dimensions, thoughts, feelings, values, motivations, fears, and desires. How often, for you faculty who have innovated and tried to get your colleagues to see how valuable this was, have you approached the problem concerned about the fears that you are raising for the person who you're trying to get to come to do things your way? How often have you worried about how you might be challenging something they value deeply or something they desire? Or do you spend most of your time just showing them the data, making sure they understand your way is better? So let's talk about how people model change. There are a lot of books on change, a lot of articles. There's a whole research area on change. There's one in education, and there's one in business, and they overlap some, but not always. And most of us think that we're going to change people like a science project, right? We will pilot something. We will prove it's better. And then they will see the data and they will change. How many of you, when you take off on piloting something, that's exactly your expectation? I have conclusive proof it doesn't work. How do I have this conclusive proof? Well, I didn't publish this, but I did a meta-analysis of all of the, maybe not all, a lot of the research on engineering education. First of all, none of the projects ever failed. It's just an amazing thing. When we set out to do something to improve engineering education, it succeeds 100% of the time. Maybe that's the lesson. Maybe even if as much as we wanted, it always seems to help when we set out to improve engineering education. When that's what's on our mind, when it matters enough to see if we got improvement, it always improves some aspect of the educational experience or outcomes for the students. But even if, while you have a passionate set of cohorts, or a single individual, or you get out to the next wave of people, for some reason, it seems to lose its energy within 5 years. That's not 100% of the time that it loses its energy, but a great amount of time. I have been on major projects that had major funding, that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that we can improve the learning outcome, the quality of student experience, the quality of graduate. And we could get it adopted at several universities. And as soon as those people who were passionate about it and understood its complexities, but had made the compromises that you have to make to get it to pass, as soon as they moved on because they were tired, because they got promoted, because they went to another university, it always decayed. Now, I'm not doom and gloom, because what happens then is right after the decay gets to a certain point, another person comes and reinvents it. Slightly different, maybe better, but it gets reinvented. I'm amazed after spending taxpayers' money to prove something, how many of us will go after more taxpayer money to prove the exact same thing again? How many times do we need to prove that active learning and teaming makes for a better experience for students? How many times do we need to prove that helping the students to integrate the material from one subject matter to another, crossing boundaries of one field to another, is going to deepen their learning and broaden their learning? How many times do we need to prove that making it relative to something in their life or something they aspire to do is going to make learning deeper? How many of those experiments do we need to run? Because if this was my technical field, and I went and asked for money to do the same experiment that has been done dozens, if not hundreds of times, even with this kind of student body, nobody in their right mind would give me the money. But in engineering education, many people, surely not the people in this room, many people go over and over again to get the same dollars, to prove the same thing, because of course you know that students at Texas A&M, being the human beings they are not at all like the students at Olin College, being the human beings that they are. Right? Couldn't possibly. Yeah.
Is it possible, however, that what we're proving isn't what we think we're proving?
Yes. What do you,
That it's not the
Exactly. Perfect. Okay, I'll stop. Not. But is that true just in engineering education? Have you seen researchers in very technical areas that were very passionate? And when that passion dies, when they've had to write one too many grants, one too many papers, when somebody's passionate about service, but on their 473rd committee, it's just not as much fun as it used to be, especially those of us who are always on the diversity committees. Okay? After a while, you're kind of like, I think we've had this conversation. Oh yeah, it was other people besides y'all? Okay? So this is not a phenomenon we have to prove. But as somebody said, what do we value? What do we reward? It's hard to keep up passion when you feel like what I'm doing is not valued. And so we have to talk about that kind of change. Let's talk about various ways you model change. I'm going to give you quickly some theorists, they're empirical in their background too, on modeling change. Some people will model change saying you need to focus on the people who are going to do the changing. Not be a change agent, but do the changing. They may also be a change agent. Let me make this clear to you, my difference here. When I change what I do in my classroom, I'm a changer. But if I'm not motivating change beyond my classroom, I'm not a change agent. Okay? So Myerson wrote a book called Tempered Radicals. Any of you read that? Good. Okay, I could tell you anything about the book and you just believe it. All right? Tempered radical. What she has done is she studies change. She says, 1, organizations are always changing. 2, small changes and adaptations do matter. So they don't have to be big. The small ones matter too. And change emerges with little prods. And she talks about it's often the tempered radical that causes change, not the radical. The tempered radical is on the inside, but trying to make it change. Now, there have been days when I wanted to blow up my university. Okay? That would be radical. Okay? But most days, I want to keep working there. I want it to change, but I want to keep working. I want to rock the boat, but I want to stay in the boat. Okay? I don't want to rock it so much that the boat tips over and sinks. All right? So as much as needs to be changed, it's not worth it to me to be so radical that we entirely do away with the system. I know in engineering education there are some people who believe it's time to be radical. Okay? But there are a lot of people who are tempered radical, and what you can do in your domain, according to Myerson, is worth doing. Stay in the boat you're in, but rock your boat, wherever that boat is. Pascal Sternen talk about positive deviance. We have lots of deviance in Texas, so we like this idea of positive deviance, okay? What they say is there are always positive exceptions to the rule. A few individuals or an organization with the same constraints and resources, but they actually function better. Have you ever thought about that? Something not going right in your department? Have you looked around on your campus for the departments that have some of the same constraints and resources and are actually doing better? We actually had, as Dean of Faculties, I had some departments who were having trouble retaining faculty. And it was, of course, because of the community, because of the pay, because of the backwardness of this and that leader. But you could find another department in that same college, same community, same general pay, and they weren't having any problem with retention. Getting the people in one department to explore what was it that's happening in this department that makes people want to stay. And whether you're talking about faculty, as I was, or students, how many of you look at what is it that they're doing in these other fields that cause so many engineering students to start as engineers, but graduate in those other fields. They're still graduating. And if you're a campus like mine, it is very rare indeed when somebody starts in another field and comes to engineering. And I could tell you, well, that's because, we're engineers. But I'm not sure what that says. We don't want anybody who didn't know when they were 18 to come to engineering? Is that what we're saying? Our identity says that we never change our mind? I don't think that's what we're saying. We ought to be studying more about how others are doing it. Now, a lot of models on change talk about it as if it's a cycle that you have to get into. Lewin's work in 1951 talked about you have to unfreeze, move, and then refreeze. Most of us really don't like a model of refreezing our organization, but that was, in 1951, a fairly novel concept. What many of us do is we go and hit our colleagues and say, you have to change today, look what I can show you. We didn't prepare them at all. Somebody over here said, we didn't let them know there was a problem. We didn't unfreeze them at all from their position before we started trying to move them into change. And Lewin talked about that a long time ago when he said, you have to do some setup first. You have to unfreeze where you are before you can get the movement that you're after. And then he said, be sure that you make it permanent. This is what many of us forget. Gladwell, how many of you read Tipping Point? Very interesting ideas, I thought. Change is a contagious thing. Thinking of the virus thing, I'm not sure this is a good analogy, but it takes personal energy, enthusiasm, and personality to make something have that contagious aspect. Now, I hate to tell you this, but many of my electrical engineering colleagues, some even say me, don't have the personality to make something seem contagious. Okay? We think it's all about facts and data, not about personality, enthusiasm, energy, messages like that. Then we have to make it stick, its stickiness. The question is, what will you remember? I suspect from my talk today, you might remember the buzzard. See, this is very important because I'm teaching to some of you some things about change now, and you may remember some of it, but people remember the story. People don't remember the data. How many of us who have to work with legislators say, we can show them data after data after data, but they get one anecdote that looks this way, and they're totally convinced by that one anecdote. Stories are more powerful. There's an old Jewish proverb that says, what's more truthful than the truth? The story. Okay? So we don't pay enough attention to how we tell it. And then, Gladwell says, change is actually not gradual. It will tip. You have to keep doing your incremental things. You have to keep doing that until it tips. But don't think this is going to be a linear progression. Don't set up your metrics as if it's going to be a linear progression. Tichy, another person who wrote about change, many things about the stages of change he talks about, but one thing he talks about that I think is important, he talks about transitions. There has to be a death and a rebirth process. We don't help our colleagues with the death of some previous behavior. We just want them to go right into rebirth. It doesn't work that way. We have to get them through those cycles. And another one who talks about cycles is Satir. And Satir says we're in a status quo, and then something foreign comes, and then we go into chaos. Then we get an idea about how to transform. We integrate that idea, and we get to a new status quo. Think about your colleagues. You are most judgmental to them when it is chaos in their head. That's why your change agency often isn't as successful as it should. You have introduced something that is foreign to them. They're going along, they know how to teach their classes, they've been doing it for 20 years, they get pretty good reviews, nobody's ever told them that they're not one of the best teachers in the department. You introduce something that they have to start doing to be really good, and you have the data to prove it. You throw them into chaos. If you don't expect and help them with that chaos, then their decision is going to be how to reject everything you have ever done and kill you professionally if possible. Many of you have experienced that in your home departments. And so, according to Satir, you should have expected it. One of my favorite persons who writes about change is Cotter, John Cotter. He talks about stages. He says, first you set the stage. You create a sense of urgency. You pull together the right guiding team. They decide what to do. They develop a change vision and a strategy. They start making it happen by communicating for understanding. They empower others to act. They produce short-term wins before they go for the big wins. They don't let up. And then finally, they make it stick. Sounds very methodical. So if you just follow those steps, I'm pretty sure that probably in 6 months we can change all of engineering education. Even Cotter knows it doesn't work that way, as simple. But those are important steps to be thinking about.